Colleagues, I will now invite our next speaker, Professor Henning Melber, who will speak about African voting in the UN system, UN General Assembly. Professor Henning Melber is an associate of us at NAI and former research director of the Nordic Africa Institute. Extraordinary professor at the University of Pretoria and the University of Free State in Bloemfontein, as well as senior research fellow with the Institute for Commonwealth Studies at the University of London. Henning, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Therese, and good day to everyone, both in the room and those who will later have the opportunity to watch. I would like to make a presentation which first summarizes the voting behavior of the 54 African member states of the United Nations, and then engage with the different factors and affinities which might influence such voting behavior. Beyond the criteria, or partly because of the criteria which have already been presented by Kwesi and by Assem, and certainly will be complemented by Bayo. There were 5 resolutions in the UN General Assembly on the war in the Ukraine. Some tend to be forgotten, and they fall into 2 different categories. And I will pay some attention to both, because there are some minor but notable shifts in voting behavior of the African member countries. 3 of the Assembly resolutions, the first, the second, and the fourth, were dealing in a subsequent way with the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. The first one, on the 2nd of March, demanded full withdrawal from the Ukraine. 28 of the African member states supported the resolution. 1 voted against. The second resolution on the 24th of March reaffirmed the commitment to the UN Charter and reiterated the demand for Russia's withdrawal. On that resolution, 27 of the African member states supported the resolution and 1 abstained. The third resolution, which was in the sequences the fourth, but relating to those first 2, was taken on the 12th of October, declaring the referendums invalid and illegal under international law. And here's the interesting part. 30 African member states voted yes, and none voted against. There were 2 other resolutions dealing with particular aspects. Chronologically, the third was taken in the UN General Assembly on 7th of April, demanding the suspension of Russia's membership in the UN Human Rights Council. Only 10 African member states supported the resolution, 9 voted against. And the 5th and so far last resolution was presented and voted on the 14th of November, demanding payment of reparations from Russia to the Ukraine. And it's notable again to compare that voting behavior with the one on the suspension from the UN Human Rights Council, because 14 African member states voted in support of the resolution and only 5 against. So just to recall the comparison between those 2 resolutions. The first one, 10 yes, 9 no. And the second one, 14 yes and 5 no. Numbers do matter, and they indicate shifts. And it's for political scientists and others to come up with maybe some sensical or sometimes nonsensical, as we are as political scientists, explanations for such shifts. But there's one primary lesson when it comes to the voting behavior. Africa is divided. It has no common policy, despite normative frameworks which are in place. Decisions remain guided finally by national interests and the affinity to one of the global blocs. There are value-based frameworks, and I would like to use the second part of the three to give voice to one of those who articulated the fundamental framework of value-based African policy. It was the permanent representative of Kenya, Martin Kimani, who just days before the invasion of the Ukraine made a statement in the UN Security Council. And I like to give him voice by quoting a few of the excerpts from his statement. I quote, "At independence, had we chosen to pursue states on the basis of ethnic, racial, or religious homogeneity, we would still be waging bloody wars these many decades later. We believe that all states formed from empires that have collapsed or retreated have many people in them yearning for integration with people in neighboring states. This is normal and understandable. After all, who does not want to be joined to their brethren and to make common purpose with them? However, Kenya rejects such a yearning from being pursued by force. We must complete our recovery from the embers of dead empires in a way that does not plunge us back into new forms of domination and oppression. Multilateralism lies on its deathbed tonight. It has been assaulted today as it has been by other powerful states in the recent past. Let me conclude, Mr. President, by reaffirming Kenya's respect for the territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders." End of the quote. This is merely an affirmative loyalty to the Charter of the AU and going back to the agreement of the Organization of African Unity to respect the colonial drawn boundaries. Actually, every African member state of the AU subscribes to these principles. And still, voting behavior differs for a variety of other factors. As Kimani pointed out, the fundamental value-based reference point is the right to self-determination and territorial integrity. A clause many of the constitutions of African countries includes as a top priority. So basically, if that is your own national constitutional principle, why don't you apply it to other countries? Well, there is a factor called solidarity with and support to national struggles for self-determination, which again relates to the history of most African countries. And in retrospective, the association is the Soviet bloc supported our struggle for national independence, not the West. But what is overlooked conveniently is that the Soviet Union included the Ukraine. The Ukraine supported, as Russia did, the struggle for independence and the right to self-determination. So this is a bias, a flawed perspective, which relates to another perspective which is rooted in historical realities. there are reasons in many African countries to have strong anti-Western sentiments. The Western countries, the Central European countries, were the colonizers of the continent. The Western countries since then applied double standards. There was reference now in the debates about transactional aspects. From an African perspective, transactional aspects would be, after centuries of humiliation and oppression, you in the West better shut up instead of lecturing us. We need to understand these sentiments to understand why some African countries and their governments find it extremely difficult to side with the West. On the other hand, it underlines again that double standards exist everywhere. Colonialism in many African countries is perceived as a matter of the West. If you ask people in Eastern Europe and in Asia, they would rather perceive colonialism as a matter associated with the Tsarist Empire. Russia would not border to Alaska without the Russian Empire being, at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, the third biggest colonial power in the world. Only that the African perspective has not been confronted with that. So again, perspectives also come into the picture. And of course, geostrategic and material interests. And we listen to Kwesi and we listen to Assem and we know what it means. And I'm very sure when it comes to despotic and authoritarian regimes versus the fight for democracy and civil rights, we will learn more from Bayo's presentation. There are some governments on the continent depending on Russia. There are others depending on China. And let's be honest, there are others depending on the West. So voting behavior has to do, of course, also with geostrategic and material interests and not with value-based normative frameworks. One of the problems why the UN Charter has never been, through the bar, been applied even-handedly. Another lesson seems to be diplomacy matters. Until now, the Ukraine had no meaningful presence in Africa. It was unknown territory. There were no human interactions, which are very relevant for empathy and taking sides. But Ukraine was unknown. That slightly changed and is an indication that it matters to have human interactions with Foreign Minister Kubela's visit in parallel to the Foreign Minister of Russia, Lavrov, the continent and 4 states, because after that, miraculously, Senegal changed its voting behavior. So you create understanding by interacting. The announced Ukraine-Africa summit could build and anchor further such understanding. The just announced subsidized food initiative, Grain from Ukraine, with international support, including the World Food Programme, is a significant effort. Let me end with mentioning the main challenge. Building of trust after a history of double standards and hegemonic Western rule, reinforced by the just ended COP27 as the last example, based on which value-based frameworks are recognized and respected, and those in violation condemned by all others. It needs trust and confidence in these frameworks to base your voting behavior on such reference points. This would also include a reform of the United Nations Security Council, giving African member states more voice and influence. If you are feeling treated marginalized all the time throughout history, you find it more difficult to side with those you perceive as holding the power of definition. That happens in any family. Why should it not happen in the family of states? So, in conclusion, the West has no legitimacy to claim a moral high ground. Ukraine, in contrast, almost like being collateral damage, has all the reasons to do so. But it is judged and damned by association in a divided world. It is denied the solidarity it deserves in the struggle to maintain the right for self-determination and national sovereignty. Fundamental principles which ought to be as a priority close to the heart of all people and governments, especially on the African continent, which were the subject of colonization, are actually, by the voting behavior, betrayed.